Hi everybody. This little video is supporting the outdoor session that we're going to be doing, um, based on surfaces and form is the overall title. Just to give you an explanation, the day will be about actually the way we paint and the way we put marks on our canvas or paper or whatever. That's going to be where the emphasis is. When we talk about surfaces and form. Uh, when we look at the world around you, it's full of different surfaces, I guess, leaves and trees and sand and all sorts. And through the years, a lot of artists have made different types of marks to suggest those things. How do we make a suggestion of a tree or a twig or whatever it happens to be? So we're going to be using mark making methods, different ways of putting the paint on to suggest that. When we talk about form, we often talk about space and depth and how things look three-dimensional or whatever. And that's essentially, and in most cases, to do with uh, light and shade, tone. So when we look at the world around you, we will see things in various tones. And so on the day, what we want to do is be aware of all those tones, but at the same time, make marks that have an interest and an expression about them and a feeling of surface. A lot of artists, as I say, have done this. And the essence of a painting really is the interest of the paint. What we don't want to do on the day is be overly fixated with the picture in front of us. In other words, there's a picture that we see, and as it were, and there's my canvas, there's my paper. I've got to reproduce that onto that. What we're trying to do is look at the picture and take from it the bits, the shapes, and the forms and the textures that we see, and be inspired by that to make marks on a board, which will suggest that, but will make an interesting painting. So when the picture's gone, when you take that painting away and hang it up somewhere or set it somewhere, what will be interesting will be the paint and the way the paint blends in certain ways and the beauty of that. It won't be necessarily that's a photographic image of what you saw earlier. So that's what I'm going to be emphasizing on the day. And it's what also I'm going to be emphasizing in this little upcoming video that you're going to see. So keep that in mind. It's a great opportunity to express yourself with paint, but at the same time, observe the world around you. Okay, so we'll get started with that then. Thought it would be nice to show you, thought it'd be nice to show you some examples of this business of surfaces and marks that you can make with a brush in watercolor if you're a watercolor painter, um, and how artists over the years have done this. And the first example here, pardon me, is Georgia O'Keeffe. You can see hopefully on the screen here. I'll make it slightly bigger. George O'Keeffe worked in the 20th century, very famous artist, American, worked in, I think, New Mexico or somewhere like that, and did a lot of painting in oils, maybe primarily, but she did work in watercolors. And her work developed an abstract style, really, although within it you still see references to things. If you have a look at her work, you'll see that she painted skulls of, animals that you'd find in the desert, the skull of a sheep or whatever it is, and flowers and close-up sections of flowers, so they become almost abstract. But in this little picture that we're looking at, you can see there it's obviously reference to a landscape. But look at the marks and the surfaces and the way the brush has been used within this landscape and the way it's applied, sometimes in little spots, sometimes in little strokes. Sometimes she's allowed the paint to run and dribble, and sometimes she's sort of controlled the paint a wee bit more. So there's a lot of different things going on in this. But the result is a picture that is really bordering on being abstract. I mean, the first thing we see, I believe, is when we look at it, is pattern and color. That's the first thing I see. There's two little birds, I can see up here, two little bird forms here. If you took those out, other than that, you would have really what looks like an abstract painting, but you do know it's a landscape. You can see references to hills, maybe like a river down here or something. But that's what O'Keeffe did within her work. This painting is by Paul Klee, again, early 20th century, mid 20th century. Forget when Klee died. I think it was earlier than that. And he had this interest again in almost abstracting things, but not quite. There, you can see references to things in the pictures, in the paintings. And here we have a little watercolor of a little village scene, a little landscape with buildings. But again, look at the way he's allowed the marks to work. So he's not forcing it. He's allowing when the paint dribbles or runs a little bit, he's kind of allowing that to happen and allow us to appreciate the beauty of the paint. That when paint does certain things, it can be very beautiful. So we not only see this as a picture of a landscape, but also as a picture which is full of color, pattern, and enjoyment for the sake of the brush marks themselves. This actually I'm going to have to blow up for you bigger, and I hope you can see it because it appears to be white. And I say I hope you see this, but it is actually Turner. And obviously, Turner was very famous for watercolors and so on. And this was painted in 1820. And again, you're maybe going to have to stare at it a bit because it looks like a completely abstract piece of painting with white and bluey marks on it. But it's actually a ship off the coast of England somewhere that's titled, I forget what the title is, but that's what it is. And then suddenly you realize right down, there's a horizon of sorts here down the bottom, the sea, and you can see sort of steam or smoke or something coming up here, and a little reference of a mark to a boat or a ship sailing, and the clouds. You can see, look at up here at the top, you can see clouds, but look how loosely that is painted. And look how much water he probably used because it's so light. But the atmosphere is this misty, overcast, strange sort of day, and the sea is hazy. And just about you can see through the haze the little reference on the horizon on the water there, a ship. And it's so freely painted, not many brush marks. All the paint runs around quite freely. So you don't, unlike the previous two or three, you don't see lots of dots or anything. And what's amazing is to remind ourselves that this was painted in 1820, a very expressive painting, a very bordering abstract painting, uh, done so many years ago. And now look at this one, completely different in a way. And of course, it's our old friend Van Gogh. And yes, it is a watercolor. And Van Gogh did do some watercolors. I think the story behind this one was that it was seized by the Nazis or something and then found again by someone and then went to auction or something like that. But it's one of his favorite subjects, haystacks and things. But it's watercolor paint. But again, if you look, lots of marks, loads of little short brush marks, as he did always in his paintings, but simply using watercolor this time. So watercolor, like any other medium, can have different marks, of course. Use a smaller brush, bigger brush, broad strokes, short strokes. And all of these people that you've seen here give you examples of how uh, we can interpret the landscape. So on the day, allow that to happen. So the same approach can be taken with watercolor. So the same idea of mark making and surfaces. So if we'll begin the same sort of way. We take a little brush, maybe some very watery paint, and again maybe indicate the main structure of what we're looking at. So again, there we are with our trees. And all this is a barely damp brush. It's just enough to make a mark so that I can kind of find my way into the shapes in the picture. There's another a little branch there, or tree trunk here, and there's this dark one there. So these are helpful, these verticals, so they give me a place to position things when I come to actually apply the paint. You can, if you wish, maybe indicate, well, there's an area here where there's the darker section down here. But I think it's probably best not to overdo detail at this point, because I could draw these branches. There's a lot of branches there, of course, and I could start to get really obsessed with these. But remember, this is not what the exercise is about. The exercise is how I fill this canvas, or rather paper, with marks that interpret that picture, that scene in front of me. So again, if I'm taking, like I did with the acrylic paint, I'm getting some greens and things on the go here, and maybe drop a little crimson in there again. I'm not sure whether you're seeing this on your screen or not, but it's obviously giving me a nice deep tone. And this time I can work like I did with the acrylics, little small marks, squiggly marks in the spaces, and think, right, okay, there's a little gap in there, there's a little gap in between these ones. And again, what I'm doing is I'm leaving the color, the light paper, because what I can do in the case of watercolor is come back over that. So whilst I don't have white in the same way that I did with my acrylic paint, what I can do is use the light of the paper. But what I'm showing you there's the gestures again. Look at the speed that my hand's moving around. You know, I'm keeping on the move here and here. I know this is a slightly bluer green, at least when I'm looking at this picture that I have in front of me, it feels a wee bit more bluer. So, you know, we can go back over that as well. But we're trying to get in the deeper tones, if you like, primarily. So we get that in there. We get some more reds in there, and maybe we drop in some of this down here, this lovely darker tones, you know. And again, moving constantly, leaving the marks to be seen and hopefully enjoyed, you know. And it's a slower process, this, but that's the nature of it all, you know. And then we can work up here. While we're at it, we'll work up some of this lighter, paler lemony green. I'm using the same brush with this deliberately to make me keep the same or similar sort of marks. So there I am blocking away at this. It can be as watery as you want, because as you know, with watercolor, the lights are achieved with the dilution of the paint. You know, more dilute watery paint will make lighter colors generally, you know. And even when I come to this bit, I'm blending them together a wee bit. I don't need them to be separate blocks, as long as the way I'm approaching the paint is the same gesture of my hand constantly. We'll very quickly go up to this area here, and we'll get some other greens in there. Okay, so I'm taking a wee bit of cadmium yellow and green in there, and I know that again it's probably much brighter than it probably is, but it's the marks. It's all about the marks. Okay, so we're daubing this in here and daubing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill that up a bit more, and then I'm going to show you what we can do in terms of working on top of this. Now this is interesting in the sense that this is that little piece of watercolor, which is dry, pretty much dry, not totally dry, but as dry as I could get it. Inevitably with watercolor there will be bleeding, so therefore the little individual dots that I had at one stage are still there, but some of them have bled, but it actually makes it quite a nice sort of an effect, if you like. So what I want to do now is think, okay, we've got one layer of this. We can then, using the same method, build up extra colors and things on top of this. So still using that same little brush, same methodical squiggly technique, But in doing so, we can add some more information. In other words, we can say, well, that was a bit darker, that was a bit lighter, that was a bit more greener, or whatever it is. So we can be a wee bit more accurate in looking at the illusion of depth and space. So for example, if I am just mixing up some more color here, I'm mixing up some viridian green and good old crimson red to give us a very neutral color. Um, and it's just about green and no more. So I can go into these areas and say, well, look, what I felt was the this area here was maybe stronger, darker. So I'll apply that there. I might find that is happening. Well, it is happening in a sense in other places when I really, really look at it. So I might say, well, look, there are little deeper tones across the top of that. And in some ways, what I'm doing as I'm doing is maybe occupying those spaces with just simply with paper, where there's no down at the bottom of this is maybe a little bit more strength, and so I can maybe begin to go through the picture, saying, well, there's a lovely dark shadowy bit there, but whatever I'm doing, it's the same style. Okay, so here I'm getting there's a little dot there. And by the way, there's no reason as an artist you might say, you know what, I liked it the way it was. I'm not going to do any more to it. And if you happen to feel that way, then absolutely let that be. You are the interpreter of the world around you. Um, you're not the reproducer of the world. You're not the you're not replicating everything that you see. So I can begin to make choices about where I have the dark and the light here, and there's also lovely deep tones maybe up in this tree that have kind of got lost in the last bit, so I can go in over that. The important thing to remember is to try and keep the rhythm and excitement. So sometimes when you do this, it is possible just to let yourself become tight again, and then you kind of lose some of the excitement. You may want to break up a few little marks that way and this way, suggesting the branches. And you notice when I'm doing that, I'm I'm breaking them up. They're not a slow, continuous mark, okay? So they're melding into the style. And we can do that. And there's a lovely dark bit actually I've just spotted, just creeping up onto the trees or onto the leaves there at the top. And also while we're at it, is really see if I can deepen that one a wee bit more. So just dot, 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 dot to that. One or two little dark dots down at the bottom of these as well. And we can then maybe go up amongst the leaves and say, yeah, well, there's some of those greens were really quite deep. Some of those greens, were not as quite as pale as this. So we can maybe go back with a kind of almost like a wash on top of those darker greens and make them that a little bit deeper again. So I'm dabbling around there and maybe up in here a little bit and so on. So I suppose what I'm doing is creating a little more variety in the tonal values of things. So there's a darker tones going up in there as well. And I think the secret, or not the secret, I think the thing to remember is to be aware all the time of what's this painting look like, what's happening to it. Yeah, this is doing that, that's doing that. I like what that's doing, or I don't like what that's doing. So, be aware of at what point you maybe find, okay, look, this is good, this is not so good, and so on. There's still parts of this are dry that I haven't touched, and one of the things you can simply do is take a wash of a color, same brush, but what I'm doing is I'm mixing up now basically a cadmium yellow with a tiny wee bit of green in it, but it's very, very thin on the end of the brush, and just going over the top of these areas. So over here, I'm just putting a little wash on. So I'm seeing the marks that I made a moment ago still there, but I'm warming them up. I'm saying, well, let's warm this whole area up here. So those little underneath marks will still show through. In other words, but the bits that were white paper or light paper are now gone. And what it does is it creates a warmth to the whole thing there. And the same perhaps over here. I could bring out the warmth. There's a nice warmth along the top of that where it meets the trees or this field or this area of grass or whatever. So I'm warming that along there and then letting that come down. I realize that all this is quite a lot cooler. So with a cooler wash, or wash, but applied with dots. So this is the blue-green going over the top of all of this to try and take down the intensity. So this little light bit sings out now the way it actually is a bit more in the photograph, in the image. So now I think I'm maybe getting something a little bit more to do with depth into the picture. This time round, what I want to do is have a look at the broader approach with a piece of some watercolor. So I'm going back to my good old big old broad brush here that I was using for other things. It's not that big, but it's a lot bigger than some of the other colors or the other brushes. Sorry. So this time what I'm going to do, same thing in the sense that we'll sketch out something here. So again, but watch the way I'm using this brush. I'm imprinting that it's broader. Got this cross piece here. So really what is important is to see the movement, as it were, rather than of my hands and my brush rather than anything else. So look, that for a reasonable amount of water on there. Actually, I suppose it could be less if I wanted, but and put in that's here. So we get our verticals in. So this time round, it's going to be less systematic and clinical. It's going to be broader. So I'm actually going to melt that away there, because I want to see this whole mass of color greens as exactly that. In other words, just areas of color. What I'm going to do here is allow the broad brush to do its thing, as it were. So I'm really kind of letting go a wee bit here, and there's much less control in what I'm doing here. What I'm doing at the minute, I'm just flooding a whole area of this yellowish tone around these areas here, and kind of letting some of it melt away. So, and in this case, it will be important what happens as I go back when it's dry. So this first layer is a big broad, as you can see there. I mop some of it up if I want, but it's a wash, I suppose we could say, right over that top area here. And then what I can do is maybe while I'm working with this sort of color, this lemony or lighter tone, I'm just making up a slightly bluer version of that down here. Lots of water, really. So it's deliberately being allowed to run here to see what happens. So there's that lower section right there. I'll just let that be for the moment, and then we'll come up and look at the middle sections, which are these darker tones that we talked about earlier. Really nice dark areas, but in this case, pardon my arm there, in this case I'm just going to flood those in again as a blob, for want of a better word, you know, in there, some in there, maybe a wee bit in there. Look. So this is just a blob of darker, blob of lighter there. Put that in. So I'm taking out of the picture the things that I see that I think are interesting to me for this particular study. So in this case, I'm leaving loads out, but I'm thinking I like the big clump at the top. I like the darks because they give me the sense of space, and I like the light against that. And I know there are variations, but we'll sort that out later. What I'll do is I'll drop in then in a moment here. I'm just drying this palette. What I'll do is I'll drop in some blues and things here. So I'm using, again, the colors are not accurate, but I just want to say, well, I want blues, and this is bleeding with the things around it, and I'm kind of letting that happen deliberately because this is how we learn about what paint does. So let's say we leave at this point, we leave what we've done literally at this point and let that dry. So this is the dried version of that little painting I made a short time ago, and you can see obviously it's bled a little bit and so on, but it's created a very nice open sort of series of shapes, vaguely suggesting those trees and the sky and so on. That's all it is. I mean, it's fairly vague, but again, if I was to take break this down a little more, in other words, with my big brush here again, fairly broad marks, I'm putting a few patches of a deeper tone of green here and there. I'm looking at the picture here, but I'm not interpreting it literally, as you can gather, but you can see that I'm reacting to things I see here. So I'm going over the top of that lighter tone there. I'm rinsing the brush a little bit now, and with a damp but not soaking wet brush, I'm moving in between here, again drying it, rinsing it slightly, and using the water to encourage the darker tones to bleed or to melt around the edges, as it were, so that it's not just a harsh line. So you can see that they relate in some way, and maybe at this point let that be, and we'll go down to the lower part there, and again with the big brush, this is a slightly cooler tone, maybe in the foreground, but it's big broad strokes. I'll put that in there. Sorry. And it bleeds a little bit. It'll bleed even more, I'm sure. Let that be. Don't mess with it. We don't know what we're going to get because all paints are liquid and they move around in all sorts of different ways. So accept that, and that in a sense is the exciting part of it. To paraphrase, what was it? To paraphrase Forrest Gump, it's like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get, and the kind of painting is like life in that sense, that you sometimes think you know what's going to happen, but in most cases it's not quite the way you think it is. So again, with damp brush there, I'm just merging that always, or most of the time, with the flat of the brush, in order to stop me from being fiddly. So I can only make broad strokes here, and I have added 3 other areas. These are dry. I might try, I'll see, it may or may not work brilliantly, but I'm going to try it while this is wet, is to just put in maybe a few markers of darker tones down here, and maybe over to this one or whatever. I'm not sure if I've got the right tree now, but there's a little darker mark of a tree there, and a little darker bit there, and maybe just let that bleed a little bit. This is just water on the brush at the minute, not too much, just enough to soften that and merge that in to this foreground area here. Don't like that because it's too fiddly looking, so I'm taking a brush with some water and I'm washing it away. So what I might do at this point is let this dry, just let it sit. So now we have this next phase of the painting where this has been dried. So you can see where I put slightly deeper tones over the top of the previous lighter tones. So you're getting some variety beginning to happen there. but also the natural blending of the paint that happened as well. And this is I keep saying, it's about that beauty of the material itself. What I'd like to do now, again, still using this broad brush, is go through some of these areas. So I'm gonna have some a yellowy tone, slightly yellowy green tone, and I'm gonna put a little bit here and there, again with this big brush, a little bit there, a little bit up here at the top, and a little bit over here. So this is going over the top of some of these things. There's one or two bits there as well. What I might do then is rinse the brush as I did before. Brush is slightly damp but not wet, and just slightly trail away the edges of those blocks. But essentially they're still blocks of colour put on with a broad brush. Then what I'll do is rinse the brush again, clean that yellow off, and move to a slightly deeper, more neutral green. So I see some of that in here. You can see there's a big broad stroke. I'm going to put a broader stroke up there. Maybe a little bit on this side here, and maybe a little bit on there, on that side. But you can see it's using that big brush. Again, what I might do is rinse the brush with a slightly dampened brush, just go around the edges of those shapes ever so slightly, just so that they melt away. But I want the big chunky areas to remain as best I can. Then what I'll do is I'll come down to this area, which as we know is so very, very, very dark in parts. So again, I'm going to put in the imprint of this brush, this big brush here, a big imprint there, and so on. A little bit at the corner there, tiny little bit there. And again, rinse, wipe until it's just damped, and use that to feather away these dark areas. But I don't want to flood those with water, because then they'll not remain dark. They'll just sort of dilute a bit. So I'm just easing away the edges of those at the moment. And what I'll do is I'll come down here now and have a look and say, well, yeah, there was some broken areas of darker greens and things there. So I'm just going over some of these with this deeper sort of, I think it's a sap green here, but look at the size of those big brush marks. And again, rinse, damp brush, and just allow that to melt a little bit, but not too much. I may or may not get away with some more of the darker tones in the trees, but I'll take a risk just for the sake of the exercise and do that. So I'm going to put bum 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 in there and deepen that one slightly as well. And there was a darker tone in here, and in fact one or two darker tones, but I don't want to get carried away completely with that. What I might do is come back up here, because I've just seen some more little bits of greenery around the edges of that. So it's not just a straight line. So I'm breaking that up and making it more interesting. And what I'll do is just let that dry. So here we are at the next stage where this has dried. What I hope you begin to see is the sense that you've more variation in dark and light. So the trees the begin to get a bit more volume, a sense that maybe they're more three-dimensional, although that's not critical to the thing, but it's important if you want to create space that you create more variety of dark and light. Likewise down here, we get the feeling that we're going back into the shadows, distances there, whereas in the foreground maybe not so much. And we can keep following this process. What I might do just this time is to take some more of the blues and just drop a little more the blues in here, just dilute that ever so slightly there. So again, with the big broad strokes of this brush, put a few bluer marks here and there in between the trees. I can see one or two in around there. So I'm extracting, I keep saying this, I'm looking at a photograph here, and I'm taking out bits that I see. I think, yeah, like that, like that. There's a lot that isn't in here, but that's deliberate because that's us doing the interpretation. We carried the blue down in there and merged that a little bit. So at some point, it becomes a painting in itself and not a reproduction of what's in front of you. What I might do, if I can, and I'm not sure, I'll try it anyway, is to maybe now suggest some of these branches here. I have a feeling that it might bleed a little bit, but we'll just do it anyway for the sake of the experiment. And I'm not following exactly the photograph, I must admit. But again, with the big broad brush, same idea, couple going out this way, so on. What I might do, I can just about see something up there, suggest that. And then maybe with my, again with the brush, just damp that and just tap those so that they merge back in to the picture, so that they don't sit too harshly on top unless I choose to do otherwise, you know. So you can see there, I'm just beginning to suggest little bits of branches. They're much darker actually than what I have, and I could go back and try that. But the danger is I could lose other qualities. So this is the important thing that I'm just washing over that a little bit because I don't like that pure white there, and the same with this. So where there's pure white, I'm kind of just putting a wee bits of a neutral green over it to calm it all down. But you can hopefully see that it's beginning to take on maybe a little more interest than there was a little while ago. The same down here, there's one or two little dots of dark dots there that I might just throw in. And let that sit for a moment, let it dry, and we'll have another look at it. So what I've done with this now is I allowed it to dry. I went in again with the broad brush, just reinforcing some darker tones again here and here and way down the bottom there. And then I went in with the edge of the brush again, just with a darkish tone on the end of it here, and just imprinted a few little bits there to create sensitive branches going on there. But I still had to use this brush. If I changed the brush, the marks would be different to the style of the rest of the picture. I put another couple of little bits of blue in there and so on, and really, you know, dressed it up a wee bit in a sense. But now what I hope you can see is the difference between the styles. I'm just actually going to reach down here, bear with me, and go back to this one. So there's our little one we did in that style, with where the surface of the paint was more agitated, deliberately more movement, whereas here, big flat broad brush, lots of bleeding, more general, but a different style of painting. So there are some examples of how we can make marks with brushes primarily, and the whole idea of rhythm and pace and so on. So the basic thing is, what can you do? You can change the size of a brush you use, the type of brush you use. You can change the rhythm at which you make a mark, the speed as well. And you could change the type of mark you make. What I mean is you can make marks crisscross like that. You can stab marks. You can squiggle marks. So you can move your hand in various ways. And that might sound very playful and silly, but that is how we learn about how paint behaves. So the idea behind this workshop is that on the day that you will be looking at a landscape or something in front of you, and you will be interpreting that and deciding, you know what, I'm going to use this type of mark. I'm going to use this brush with this mark and that speed and build my paint up with lots of different marks. Responding to the landscape, you're not making a representation of the landscape, but what you're making is a painting that, if you like, has its own style.